All right. Now that you have an understanding of what Kierkegaard's view is, I want you to think about ways that you can apply it. So think about this question. Can you think of some examples of knights of faith that would fit Kierkegaard's definition? And this could be from any area of contemporary life, some past history, anything you can imagine. So pause your videos now and see if you can come up with some ideas. Okay, that was your chance to pause your videos. I won't make you just sit here and listen to silence. The thing that some of the things that I have in mind here, Kierkegaard talks a lot about faith and God, but there's not a whole lot of talk about Jesus for a particularly Christian position. I find that quite surprising. Even given the fact that he's talking about an unconditional commitment, there's a way in which his conception of God leaves a lot of room for the manifestations of that commitment in your particular life. For Christianity, living the highest form of life, the most authentic form of living for humans, is not just sitting in Catholic Church and reciting liturgy. It's not by believing in dogmas, because that form of belief, like if you're just asserting certain tenets, that has to do with concepts, language, understanding. That's very Hegelian or Cartesian. That's not what Christianity is for Kierkegaard. Christianity for Kierkegaard is living in the temporal moment in a certain passionate way in which one's entire life is invested in some kind of activity. And it has to meet all sorts of criteria in order to justify that. But there's ways in which this gives us a picture of human activity that applies to things that we wouldn't necessarily just think of as Christian or religious. Like, for example, one could have an unconditional commitment to one's work. And I mean, it's just an aside. I think one sees this all the time in movies. And that's what makes film such a fun medium or grounds for existentialist investigation. We look at Hiroshima Mon Mort and The Princess Bride, films that I think have Kierkegaardian Knights of Faith in them, but I think you actually encounter these kinds of characters in tons of films. Flash of Genius, this is a Greg Kinnear film about the guy who invents the intermittent windshield wipers. So this is a true story. It's the film didn't do super well, but I think it's actually a fantastic tale. And the way in which this man it's one of these like David and Goliath style stories where he takes on Ford Motor Company because he invented it and they were just plainly ripping him off. And he is driven to substantiate to save his name. He turns down, some initial sentiments when they try to brush him off and intimidate him. He turns down a couple $100,000 and, says, and it ruins his life when he says, I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do. Like they're destroying my identity as an inventor. By not giving me credit for this thing. It ruins his life, his relationship with his wife. He ends up getting divorced. He's financially destroyed because of this. He loses his friendship or relationship with his children. But he's like an Ahabian figure. It's like Moby Dick. He's devoted to this thing. But eventually, when the trial keeps going, they eventually offer him $30 million in order to walk away, but they won't give him credit for it. They won't admit their wrongdoing. He turns down all the money because for him, it is not about money. It is about his identity. This is just so perfectly Kierkegaardian. I think that's just, so these kind of ultimate commitments, they don't have to be things that you just do in church. I think this is what's fascinating about Kierkegaard's view. So one can have a kind of unconditional commitment to one's work. I think in some ways Kierkegaard understood his own life commitments in that way. Let me give you a totally different sort of example, because we see some examples of the way in which love is portrayed in this sort of fairy tale version in The Princess Bride. But I think there are much more realistic versions of love that really in interesting ways connect with what Kierkegaard is saying. Because remember, for Kierkegaard, the teleological suspension of the ethical, what that means is you have a kind of passionate commitment, identity defining, that justifies violating social norms. And imagine you're living in a society in which, being gay is considered, of the complete, a vice. It's considered horrible. Justifies all sorts of malevolent acts against you. So like the culture in which the film Brokeback Mountain is set. So those individuals, the characters in that story, they feel a kind of passion. It's not just about reasons and things you can mediate, but they feel this kind of passion which they deeply identify with, but they struggle with making sense of. In some ways, they might engage in a lot of self-hate because they are warped by society's norms. but at the same time, they feel compelled. They almost feel like this calling that comes from outside of them, or maybe it's this calling to be true to their selves in ways that is deeply difficult. That makes it, I think, a really Kierkegaardian story. Uh, it's also interesting. This involves risk, because if you're going to engage in transgressive love, whatever society that you live in, however your society defines that, then there's an immense amount of risk, personal risk, and it's very in the kind of anguish and pain that one experiences on a deep psychological level. The costs, I think, are real. What's interesting, I think, to think about the film Brokeback Mountain in Kierkegaard is Kierkegaard says Abraham's tale is deeply solitary. There's ways in which, if you think about the last reading of Kierkegaard, that Abraham cannot be understood by anybody but Abraham. But if you're talking about one of these relationships, any kind of Kierkegaardian event that occurs in a relationship, there has to be some kind of possibility for mutual understanding. Maybe the two individuals in this relationship, they don't have the same understanding of the relationship. Maybe one wants the other one to break free of social norms, while the other one is has a really hard time dealing with that and engages in a lot of self-hate. So there's different ways in which it might be fairly solitary, and there might not be perfect mutual understanding of what the relationship means. But I think even for Kierkegaard, he can only push the solitary nature of it so far. His own examples, in which I think The Lad and the Princess, his examples of romantic love could have types of mutual understanding. His own devotion to his work and to Regina, I think his whole premise of writing the book, even though he uses a pseudonym, has to be based on the ways in which some type of understanding is possible, as long as we're willing to move beyond the ethical. So if two individuals can move beyond the ethical, then I think this might be a perfectly kind of Kierkegaardian view. Maybe it's not exactly to the letter of what Kierkegaard says, but then I would just call it neo-Kierkegaardian. I think the film like Brokeback Mountain, or lots of examples of transgressive love, really meets what Kierkegaard is getting at. Okay, so that's yet another example. I have one more for you. Think about social or political causes being the grounds for a Kierkegaardian commitment. So you could be committed to racial justice, for example, in an identity-defining way, where you perceive this not as just a whim of yours or something you're going to do because you want to join a school club for a little while, but this is deeply defining as to how you identify, how you understand yourself. Remember the meaning of life assignment we started the course out with. The way in which you tell the story of your life, this is one of the identity defining moments of the plot of your own life. It is that important to who you are. And it's like a calling. It's like you are moved to do something for higher reasons. That in some ways is like the religious conception that Kierkegaard is invoking here. And what's interesting is, I say this violates some norms, because think about Malcolm X or Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, various ways in which people are fighting for racial and political justice, whether it's in America or other countries. You might say there's ways in which many of these characters were violating social norms. That's what kept putting them. That's why Martin Luther King ended up in the Birmingham jail or was monitored by the FBI. Malcolm X was willing to advocate for at least some forms of righteous struggle and think that anger should actually be used as a tool for political purpose. So there's ways in which maybe these movements do involve the violation of certain ethical norms, at least certain social norms at the time. So think about mainstream white society in America in the 1960s. That really was deeply suspicious of a lot of the racial rights movement, and there was a major crisis in thinking in mainstream white society. I mean, especially in the South, but I think this generalizes to the entire country, and the ways in which integration of the schools was deeply fought, and people wouldn't give up on segregation and Jim Crow laws and all of the things that we know from the history of the 60s. So there are ways in which this social movement was for justice was in deep violation and transgressed many laws and norms. But the reason I say some, though, is what's funny about it is, racial justice won, and now we don't think that in hindsight, we don't think that Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. I guess Malcolm X is more of a complicated case, so that there is a lot of depth here to thinking about the Kierkegaardian phenomenon. Like, think more about Martin Luther King Jr., where a sort of peaceful, nonviolent message for racial justice. In that case, we don't think that there was actually anything actually transgressive about ethical norms. We think Martin Luther King Jr. was right about the ethical norms. It was the mainstream white society of America that was wrong. So it violated the norms at the time. But in retrospect, it's like, if they win, if your Kierkegaardian commitment to racial or to ethical violation wins, then that sort of becomes the new ethical, and we don't see it from hindsight in the same way. Nonetheless, I think as this was experienced at the time, I think actually, though, there's a way in which this is deeply Kierkegaardian. My twist on Kierkegaard, or the ways in which I think this is really interestingly applicable to the human condition, is to think how there's some norm violation involved, but that doesn't mean you have to just be suspending all norms, and that in hindsight we can't change our conception of norms. You might actually think there's ways in which Kierkegaard gives us a conception of how moral progress is possible. Let me say the point about solitary, of course, anguish and risk, these are obvious. I mean, just think about how many, the assassination of these famous social rights figures. The solitariness is interesting because, again, there's ways in which you lose communication and mediation when you're called by a certain purpose and identity defining one. But that doesn't mean that you can't make yourself intelligible, I think, to absolutely everybody. So I think even Kierkegaard's own view, I think, faces a real dilemma here. And Kierkegaard would have to decide how strong he thinks the Knight of Faith must be fundamentally solitary. And partly my view is, in using Kierkegaard, I think there's ways in which there is a breakdown of communication. That's right. But that doesn't mean there's no hope of communication whatsoever. So there's ways in which, by joining a political cause or a social movement, this is not necessarily a solitary thing. But that doesn't mean that it can't be identity defining and fundamental to all of the reasons that one thinks shapes one's life. And it doesn't have to just be about racial justice or social justice. I think, I guess maybe all these are, not all, well, I guess it depends on how you define society, whether all of these examples that I've given you account as social justice. But there's many kinds of causes. I think what's very Kierkegaardian about a lot of these causes is to think about how events in time, sort of temporal events of history, affect one. And one is swept up in the course of history, so that now your life has a purpose. You are doing things for higher reasons, for bigger reasons that are just bigger than yourself. And if that thinks that you have to somehow break the rules in society, and to great personal risk to yourself, then I think this form of life is a very Kierkegaardian one. And in some ways, I think we can read Kierkegaard's view, existentialist view, as saying the most authentic or highest way for a human to live is to live in one of these forms. Now, of course, I'm dwelling on the social and political causes, but I think the examples of one's professional work or one's romantic transgressive love are great examples too. So let me just give you one more quote, I think, that gets at this issue that I'm talking about of moral change for Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard has one or two places where he actually says things similar to, and this is what I'm really moved by in his work that I'm pushing these interpretations for. So Kierkegaard says, "For if this duty is absolute, the ethical is reduced to the relative." So if one does have like an absolute duty to God that transcends the ethical, then somehow the ethical has been subsumed. And so this is Kierkegaard talking about the higher immediacy. It doesn't follow, nevertheless, that the ethical is to be done away with. So this is the sense in which I think the Knight of Faith has to go through and understand the ethical. You can't just ignore it, otherwise you're mere lower immediacy. But what happens is then only that the ethical then gets a quite different expression, the paradoxical expression. I think what Kierkegaard is saying here is the way that you understand yourself, if you're in one of these social movements, or if you're a knight of faith in any of the Kierkegaardian ways, if you're Abraham, then things do make sense to you, even if you don't think you can successfully communicate that to others. So if it seems right to you, there's a way in which the ethical, whatever we call the ethical, is that which seems fundamentally right to you. But it seems right to you in your particularity, but that like becomes a new ethical in some ways for you. And maybe if your cause, if your conception of justice is successful, that then might seem like the ethical thing to everyone who comes after you. But that's only in hindsight. That doesn't mean that this wasn't exactly experienced sort of existentially from the folks in the moment as fundamentally Kierkegaardian. Now, just to go back then to the question of Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King, and the question of whether we want to push for violating the ethical in a stronger sense, I would say, this is a challenge to you. Think how far you would be sympathetic with a Kierkegaardian ultimate commitment. Like, do you think that fighting on behalf of the anti-fascist movement is justified because of your higher calling? Could that actually be moral? And what I mean is not just like, I mean, if we're going to really think about this, like doing things that from one point of view would be considered morally atrocious, could that be justified because of your commitment to a certain cause? Could there be righteous violence, or is that fundamentally wrong? That is to say, how far are you willing to go down this road with Kierkegaard? Like, are you willing to just stop at Martin Luther King, the easier example to understand, to make sense of ethically, or are you willing to go further to Malcolm X or to the anti-fascists? And I mean this in a really interesting, philosophically challenging way, where I want you to try to make up your own minds, because I'm about to make it even harder for you. Because Kierkegaard's view can seem very attractive in some of the examples that I've given. It's powerful. But at the same time, I don't want to just paint this rosy picture of it. I think Kierkegaard wouldn't want us to paint a rosy picture of it. If we're not slightly horrified by it, then I think we haven't fully understood Kierkegaard. So in philosophy, I think we always want to try to push counterexamples to views. And this is one way of thinking about it. Could Kierkegaard's view not just justify things which ultimately we don't find that reprehensible, or maybe even things that we find praiseworthy? Like if Nelson Mandela and the way in which his fight against apartheid was fundamentally all-consuming and identity-defining for him, if that is Kierkegaardian, well, that's an easy example, because fundamentally we agree that apartheid was an unjust and vile system. But what about things that we aren't attracted to? Like, could Kierkegaard's view justify terrorism? Now, I didn't want to just give you images of terrorism, because it's far too easy to use pictures to paint cliched and stereotypical conceptions of terrorism. So I encourage you to think about the concept and examples of terrorism very broadly. Think about all the examples you can. Particularly, and I take terrorism to be a thick moral word. If we actually think of it as terrorism, we think of it as morally atrocious. So this is now getting closer to what Kierkegaard maybe did want us to think about Abraham as. So consider this quote from Kierkegaard: the paradox that keeps him at extremity, in which he cannot make clear to anyone else. For the paradox that he puts himself as the single individual in an absolute relation to the absolute, his justification once again is the paradox. Well, you can justify all sorts of things according to paradox. So couldn't one think that one's cause, in which one engages in acts of terrorism, one is justified because one is unconditionally committed to this cause? If Kierkegaard doesn't have a broader ethical check on the things that we want to agree are okay unconditional commitments, if we are truly teleologically suspending the ethical, then how could Kierkegaard not rule out things which actually are going to make us think that his view is deeply problematic and not fundamentally attractive? Now, I say this not because that it should be a knockdown refutation of Kierkegaard. I think Kierkegaard has various ways of trying to respond to this, and in some ways, he even is thinking about some of these issues. So he says in one place, yet if he did not love as Abraham, he's talking about any person who might love their son and do act similar. All thought of offering Isaac would be a temptation. And the way that I read this is, Kierkegaard realizes if you want to act like Abraham and murder a son or a child, that doesn't necessarily mean you're right and you're being a knight of faith and you're doing things correctly. You might just be lapsing into temptation. You might be listening to the devil on your shoulder and not the God on your shoulder. So there are true constraints. Something can't be a justifying unconditional commitment just because you think it is. I think that's one thing Kierkegaard is trying to get at. Or in other places, he says, that the individual can easily take this paradox for a temptation is true enough. I think this is the exact same idea, that you can think that you can paradoxically and irrationally justify anything, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're acting as a knight of faith. It might just be mere temptation. You might actually be delving back into sin and lower immediacy. Okay, so yeah, again, Kierkegaard, here's one other quote. Or if it could be done, and the individual had misunderstood the deity, this is like listening to the devil on your shoulder, not the voice of God, what salvation would there be for him? I take it here Kierkegaard is saying, if we really do it wrong, because that is a real possibility, then we are damned. We are horrible. We are just the murderers. We are not the knights of faith. So I think in some ways, Kierkegaard asks us to teleologically suspend the ethical, but that doesn't mean that there are no conditions, there are no constraints. And in some ways, it's hard to even think in Hegelian terms about what the constraints could be, because Hegel's only concept for that is the ethical. So I think one thing Kierkegaard is right about is if we're going to make sense of his view, we have to even perhaps leave Hegel behind even further than Kierkegaard was willing. That's my recommendation for trying to get at what's moving or plausible or attractive about Kierkegaard. Okay, so that's just some things I really want you to think about, because I think there's ways in which Kierkegaard's view is very powerful, and it applies to so many things in contemporary society. And I just want you to try to come to your own understanding about the human condition by having this view in your repertoire, something you get. Okay, so let me just give a final summary. The greatest form of life, human life for Kierkegaard, this is unconditional commitments, and his example of this is how the knight of faith works. So that gives the depiction of the most authentic being for us. And I think the question about constraints is one of the most interesting ones, and this is really just not developed enough in Kierkegaard. So it just rewards our thought quite a bit to consider. But I think Kierkegaard at least has the room to say, you have to have reasons that transcend some sort of norms to really be a knight of faith. Whether that means all norms or not, that's something I was questioning. And he at least has rooms to say, you can't just be returning to being selfish. That doesn't make you a knight of faith. And you can be wrong about thinking your unconditional commitment justifies atrocious acts, and that doesn't make it right. And then the last thing I think is a really rich avenue to think about is, to what degree could this be communal? I think Kierkegaard does have a clear line in ways in which it's not. But again, that could be an artifact of him focusing so much on Abraham and so much on Hegel's philosophical worldview. And if we don't just take Abraham as the sole example, and if we're not stuck in 1800s philosophical terminology and Hegel's metaphysics, then I think there's ways in which we can develop Kierkegaard's views much more broadly. Okay, thanks.